why does frequent consumption of vegetables appear to cut one's odds of depression by more than half? And by more frequent, they mean eating vegetables not 3 or more times a day, but just 3 or more times a week. But even that seemed to cut the odds of developing depression by 60% after controlling for a long list of variables. In the 2012 study that found that eliminating animal products improved mood within 2 weeks, the researchers blamed arachidonic acid, primarily in chicken and eggs, which may adversely impact mental health via a cascade of brain inflammation. But better moods on plant-based diets could also be from the good stuff in plants, a class of phytonutrients that crosses the blood-brain barrier into our heads. This recent review in the journal Nutritional Neuroscience suggests that eating lots of fruits and vegetables may present a non-invasive, natural, and inexpensive therapeutic means to support a healthy brain. Yeah, but how? Well, to understand the latest, we need to understand the underlying biology, the so-called monoamine theory of depression, the thought that depression may arise out of a chemical imbalance in the brain. Here's the oversimplified version. One of the ways the billions of nerves in our brain communicates with one another is through chemical signals called neurotransmitters. Here's the end of one nerve and the beginning of another. This is what it actually looks like under a microscope. Note the two nerve cells don't actually touch. There's a physical gap between them. To bridge that gap, when one nerve wants to tap the other on the shoulder, it releases chemicals into that gap, including 3 monoamines: serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. These neurotransmitters then float over to the other nerve to get its attention. The first nerve then sucks them back up to be reused the next time it wants to talk. But it's also constantly manufacturing more, and an enzyme, monoamine oxidase, is constantly chewing them up to maintain just the right amount. The way cocaine appears to work is by acting as a monoamine reuptake inhibitor. It blocks the first nerve from sucking back up those 3 chemicals, and so there's this constant tapping on the shoulder, this constant signaling to the next nerve. Amphetamines work in the same way, but also increase monoamine release. Ecstasy works like speed, but just causes comparatively more serotonin release. After a while, the next nerve may be like, enough already, and downregulate its receptors to turn down the volume. It puts in earplugs. So you need more and more of the drug to get the same effect. And then when you're not on the drug, you may feel crappy because normal volume transmission just isn't getting through as much. Antidepressants are thought to work along similar mechanisms. People who are depressed appear to have elevated levels of monoamine oxidase in their brain. That's the enzyme that breaks down those neurotransmitters. And so if you have too much of that enzyme in critical parts of your brain, the black circles are the levels in the brains of depressed individuals, and white circles are that of healthy individuals. If the levels of your neurotransmitter-eating enzyme is elevated, right, then your levels of neurotransmitters drops, and you become depressed, or so the theory goes. So a number of different classes of drugs have been developed. The tricyclic antidepressants, named because they have 3 rings, like a tricycle, appear to block norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake. And so even though your enzymes may be eating these up at an accelerated rate, what gets released sticks around longer. Then there came the SSRIs, like Prozac, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now you can know what that means. It just blocks the reuptake of serotonin. Then there are drugs that just block the reuptake of norepinephrine, or more dopamine, or the opposite. But if the problem is too much high levels of monoamine oxidase, why not just block the enzyme, make a monoamine oxidase inhibitor? And of course, they did. But they're considered drugs of last resort because of serious side effects, not the least of which is the dreaded cheese effect, where eating certain foods, like certain cheeses, while on the drug can have potentially fatal consequences. If only there were a way to tamp down the activity of that enzyme without the whole bleed into your brain thing and die thing. Well, now we can finally talk about the latest theory as to why fruits and vegetables may improve our mood. There are inhibitors of that depression-associated enzyme in various plants. There are phytonutrients in spices, such as cloves, oregano, cinnamon, nutmeg. But people don't eat enough spices to get enough into the brain. This dark green leafy has a lot, but its name is tobacco, which may actually be one of the reasons cigarettes make smokers feel so good. OK, but what if you don't want brain bleeds or lung cancer? Well, there is a phytonutrient found in apples, berries, and grapes, and kale, onions, and green tea that may indeed affect our brain biology enough to improve our mood. The number one question in sleep research is, why do we sleep? Followed by the question, how much sleep do we need? After literally hundreds of studies, we still don't know the best answer to either question. A few years ago, I featured a large 100,000-person study suggesting that both short and long sleep duration were associated with increased mortality, with people getting around 7 hours of sleep living longest. Since then, a meta-analysis of all such studies, including more than 1 million people, was published, and they found the same thing. We still don't know, though, if sleep duration is a cause or simply a marker of ill health. Maybe sleeping too little or too long does make you unhealthy, or maybe we see the associated lifespan shortening because being unhealthy caused you to sleep shorter or longer. Similar work has now been published on cognitive function. After controlling for a long list of factors, men and women in their 50s and 60s getting 7 or 8 hours appeared to have the best short-term memory, compared to those that got much more or much less. Same thing was just demonstrated with immune function. Both reduced and prolonged habitual sleep durations were associated with an increased risk of pneumonia. It's easy to prevent oversleeping, set an alarm, but what if your problem is not getting enough? What if you're the 1 in 3 adults that suffers symptoms of insomnia? Sure, there are drugs like Valium you can take for insomnia in the short term, but they have a number of adverse side effects, and non-pharmacological approaches such as cognitive behavioral therapy are often difficult, time-consuming, and don't always work. Wouldn't it be great to have natural treatments that can improve both sleep onset and help patients improve the quality of sleep while improving next-day symptoms over the long term? The effect of kiwi fruit consumption on sleep quality in adults with sleep problems. 2 kiwi fruit an hour before bed every night for 4 weeks. Why study kiwi fruits? Well, people with sleep disorders tend to have high levels of oxidative stress, so maybe antioxidant-rich foods may help. But all fruits and vegetables have antioxidants. But kiwi fruits contain twice the serotonin of tomatoes, but it really shouldn't cross the blood-brain barrier. Kiwi fruit has folate, and a deficiency might cause insomnia, but there's lots more folate in some other plant foods. The reason they studied kiwi fruits is because they got grant money from a kiwi fruit company. And I'm glad they did, because they found some really remarkable results. Significantly improved sleep onset, duration, and efficiency, using both subjective and objective measurements. Went from sleeping 6 hours a night to 7, just eating a few kiwi fruit. Not sleeping enough is associated with changes in diet. People tend to eat worse. But what about the opposite question? Can food affect sleep? We saw from the kiwi fruit study that this seemed possible, but the mechanism they suggested for the effect, the serotonin levels in kiwi fruit, doesn't make any sense, since serotonin can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So you can eat all the serotonin you want, and it shouldn't affect your brain chemistry. A different brain chemical, though, melatonin, can get from our gut to our brain. Melatonin is a hormone secreted at night to help regulate our circadian rhythms by the pineal gland in the center of our brain. Supplements of the stuff are used to prevent and reduce jet lag, and about 20 years ago, MIT got the patent to use melatonin to help people sleep. Melatonin is not only produced in the pineal gland, though, but also is naturally present in edible plants. That might explain the results of this study, the effects of a tart cherry juice beverage on the sleep of older adults with insomnia. The research group had been doing an earlier study on tart cherry juice as a sports recovery drink. See, there's a phytonutrient in cherries with anti-inflammatory effects on par with drugs like aspirin, ibuprofen. So they were trying to see if they could help reduce muscle soreness after exercise, and some of the participants in the study just anecdotally said that they were sleeping better on the cherries. That was unexpected. But the researchers realized that cherries are a plant food source of melatonin, so they put it to the test. The reason they chose older subjects is that melatonin production tends to drop as we age, which may be one reason why there's higher insomnia rates in the elderly. So they took a group of older men and women suffering from chronic insomnia and put half on cherries and half on placebo. Now, they couldn't use whole cherries for this study, because how could you fool people with a fake placebo cherry? So they used cherry juice versus cherry Kool-Aid, and found significant but modest improvements in sleep. So, for example, fell to sleep a few minutes faster and had 17 fewer minutes of waking after sleep onset, meaning waking up in the middle of the night. So it was no insomnia cure, but it helped without side effects. How do we know it was the melatonin, though? Well, they repeated the study, this time measuring the melatonin levels, and indeed saw a boost in circulating melatonin levels after the cherry juice, but not after the Kool-Aid. Similar results were found in people eating the actual cherries, 7 different varieties, boosting melatonin levels and actual sleep times. The effects of all the other phytonutrients in cherries can't be precluded. Maybe they help too, but if it is the melatonin, there are more potent sources than cherries. Orange bell peppers have a bit, an ounce of walnuts, a tablespoon of flax seeds has about as much as a tomato, all less than the tart cherries that were tested, but people may eat a lot more tomatoes than cherries, especially tart cherries. Sweet cherries have 50 times less melatonin than tart, and dried cherries appear to have none. In fact, the melatonin content of tomatoes was suggested as one of the reasons traditional Mediterranean diets were so healthy. A few spices are pretty potent. Just a teaspoon of fenugreek seeds or mustard seeds has about as much as a few tomatoes, but the bronze, silver, and gold go to almonds, raspberries, and goji berries off the charts. Now, even gojis just have 15 micrograms an ounce, but melatonin is potent stuff. You inject just 10 into people, and you can boost their blood levels 50-fold in 5 minutes. If you cut a hot pepper and rub it inside your nose will start running, hurting, and sneezing. Capsaicin is the burning component of hot peppers. Why would you do such an experiment? Anyone who's handled the compound in the lab knows that if it gets up your nose, it causes an intense burning sensation. However, this phenomenon has not been formally investigated. Therefore, it seemed worthwhile to study the effects produced by the topical application of capsaicin in the human nose. It therefore appeared worthwhile because it had never been done before? OK. So they took some medical students, dripped some in their nose, and they started sneezing, burning, and snotting. Describing the pain as like 8 or 9 on a scale of 1 to 10. No surprise. But here's the interesting part. What do you think happened when they repeated the experiment the next day? Now, you'd think they might be sensitized to it, like still irritated, and so might hurt even worse. But no, it hurt less. Then they did it again the next day, and the next. By day 5, it hardly hurt at all. It didn't even get a runny nose, no sneezing. Came back the next week, day 10, and still nothing. Sheesh, were they like permanently numbed? No. After a month or so, the desensitization wore off, and they were back in agony whenever they tried rubbing it in their nose. What the researchers think is happening is that the pain fibers, the nerves that carry pain sensation, dumped so much of the pain neurotransmitter called substance P that they ran out. Day after day of this, the nerves had exhausted their stores and could no longer transmit pain messages until they made more substance P from scratch, which takes a couple weeks. This gave researchers an idea. There's a rare headache syndrome called cluster headache. It has been described as one of the worst pains humans experience. Few, if any, medical disorders are more painful. It's nicknamed the suicide headache, because patients often consider taking or have taken their lives over it. It's thought to be caused by arterial dilation putting pressure on the trigeminal nerve in the face. Treatments involve everything from nerve blocks to Botox to surgery. But hey, that same nerve goes down to the nose. What if we caused the whole nerve to dump all its substance P? Preventive effect of repeated nasal application of capsaicin in cluster headache. Same as before, daily capsaicin in the nose, and by day 5 they could hardly feel it anymore. Note, though, that these were cluster headache sufferers, and so what was rated as an 8 or 9 on the pain scale by the wimpy medical students was like maybe 3 or 4 by those used to the violence of the cluster headache attacks. Having achieved desensitization, what happened to their headaches? Well, cluster headaches are one-sided headaches. You only get pain on one side of your head. So those who had rubbed capsaicin in the opposite nostril, on the wrong side of the head, nothing happened. They started out having like 40 attacks a day, and a month later, the headaches were still going strong. But those that rubbed the capsaicin in the nostril on the side of the head where the headaches were cut the average number of attacks in half. And in fact, half the patients were cured. The cluster headaches were gone completely. All in all, 80% responded, at least equal, if not better, than all the current therapies out there. Nearly 50 million Americans come down with food poisoning every year. Over 100,000 are hospitalized, and thousands die every year just because of something they ate. If they had ordered something different or chose something else at the grocery store, they or their loved one would be alive today. But in the vast majority of cases, food poisoning manifests as little more than a case of quote-unquote stomach flu, a few days of pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and then it's gone. So what's the big deal? Well, as described in the recent editorial in the American Journal of Gastroenterology, in many cases that acute infection can trigger a chronic post-infectious functional gastrointestinal disorder that can last for years or even forever. The two most common of which are irritable bowel syndrome and functional dyspepsia, which means chronic indigestion. Up to 10% of people stricken with Salmonella or E. coli or Campylobacter are left with irritable bowel syndrome. The thought is that the transitory inflammation during the infection could lead to subtle but permanent changes in the structure and function of the digestive system, causing the lining of the gut to become hypersensitized. How do they determine if someone's rectum is hypersensitive, though? Innovative Japanese researchers developed a device to deliver repetitive rectal painful distension, basically a half-quart balloon hooked up to a fancy bicycle pump that was lubricated with olive oil, inserted and inflated until they couldn't stand the pain anymore. And those with irritable bowel had significantly lower pain threshold, significantly less quote-unquote rectal compliance. Healthy people felt the pain where you'd expect to feel the pain with effectively a balloon animal in your behind, but many with IBS also experienced abdominal pain with the same procedure, indicating a hypersensitivity of the entire gut wall. Well, if that's the problem, how can we desensitize the gut? Well, we learned in the cluster headache story about the ability of hot pepper compounds to deplete pain fibers of substance P, a neurotransmitter the body uses to transmit pain. It's bad enough to have to rub hot peppers up your nose. Where do you have to stick them for irritable bowel? Thankfully, researchers chose the oral route. Conclusions. The results of this preliminary study indicate that the chronic administration of red pepper powder in IBS patients with enteric-coated pills was significantly more effective than placebo in decreasing the intensity of abdominal pain and bloating, and was considered by the patients more effective than placebo, suggesting a novel way of dealing with this frequent and distressing functional disease. Though after the 48 million cases of annual food poisoning, 10% may end up with IBS, even more may end up with chronic dyspepsia, chronic indigestion. How do peppers work against that? Well, can't use whole peppers, because then you couldn't double-blind a fake placebo pepper. But if you give capsules of red pepper powder to folks suffering from chronic indigestion, about 1½ teaspoons a day worth, and compared to placebo, within a month their overall symptoms dropped, including their stomach pain and bloated feelings, less nausea too. The frequently prescribed drug Propulsid worked almost as good as the red pepper powder, and was considered generally well tolerated. That is, until it killed you. Propulsid was pulled from the market after causing dozens of deaths. Dysmenorrhea is the medical term for painful, crampy periods. It affects almost half of menstruating women. Yet, despite the substantial effect on quality of life and general well-being, few women will seek treatment as they believe it will not help. There are treatments available, though. Modern medicine to the rescue. There are surgical options, such as neuroablation, where surgeons go in attempting to cut or destroy the nerves leading to the uterus. Or doctors can just take out your uterus completely, though there are certainly a bunch of hormones and pills and shots that can suppress the menstrual cycle altogether. Since the pain is caused by inflammation, anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen are the most commonly used, achieving symptomatic relief in about 2/3 of women. These drugs are effective, though women using them need to be aware of the significant risk of adverse drug side effects. Though there are a bunch of non-drug, non-surgical treatments like acupuncture, the evidence for the effectiveness of these treatments is generally weak. One of the latest advances in treatment involves the use of a single high dose of vitamin D. A randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. The placebo did nothing. In fact, most women got worse. But the women who got the vitamin D all felt better. But wait a second, if it's pain caused by inflammation, how about putting women on an anti-inflammatory diet? 33 women suffering from painful periods were placed on a vegan diet for 2 cycles, and experienced significant reductions in menstrual pain duration, from 4 days down to 3 days, and a significant reduction in pain intensity, as well as an improvement in symptoms of PMS like bloating. This was a crossover study, so after 2 months eating vegan, the women were supposed to go back to their regular diets to see if the pain would return. But the women felt so much better that when the researchers said, OK, now we need you to go back to your regular diet to test before and after, several said, "No way, Jose," and refused, even though they were required to by the study protocol. Doctors too often patronizingly think that patients simply won't adhere to therapeutic diets, but when they surveyed these women during the study, not only did they have fewer cramps, but they were losing weight, reported increased energy, better digestion, better sleep. This showed that you don't have to be in some Ornish or Esselstyn study facing certain death after a heart attack to stick to a plant-based diet. It's well accepted by people even when testing more benign conditions. 600 years ago, people living along the coast of Carrigain County, Ireland, started using a red algae, which became known as Irish moss. to make a jellied dessert, now the source of carrageenan, a food additive used as a thickener in dairy and non-dairy products, as well as a fat substitute, perhaps most famously in the failed Michelin Deluxe. In 2008, I raised a concern about it. We had known for decades that carrageenan had harmful effects on laboratory animals, but this was the first study done on human cells to suggest that carrageenan exposure may have a role in the development of human intestinal pathology. But that was all 5 years ago, though. What's the update? Well, after the activation of inflammatory pathways was demonstrated in actual human colon tissue samples, Europe pulled it from infant formula, out of an abundance of caution. The latest suggests carrageenan consumption could possibly lead to a leaky gut by disrupting the integrity of the tight junctions that form around the cells lining our intestine, which form the barrier between the outside world and our bloodstream. This was an in vitro study, though. In a petri dish, we still don't know what effects carrageenan has, if any, in whole human beings. Some researchers advise consumers to err on the side of caution and select food products without carrageenan, accusing the FDA of ignoring its harmful potential. Personally, after having reviewed the available evidence, I continue to view carrageenan the way I view acrylamide, another potential but not proven hazard. Acrylamide is a chemical formed by cooking carbs at high temperatures, so should we avoid a lot of these foods, like the EPA suggests? Well, food safety concerns must also be considered in the context of dietary consequences. Where's it found the most? Already unhealthy foods. So sure, use your concern about the probable carcinogen acrylamide as just another reason to avoid potato chips and French fries. But until we know more, I wouldn't cut out healthful foods like whole grain bread. Similarly, I'd use potential concerns about carrageenan as additional motivation to avoid unhealthy foods, but until we know more, I wouldn't cut out more healthful foods, though I would suggest those with inflammatory bowel disease or other gastrointestinal problems try cutting out carrageenan at least temporarily to see if your symptoms improve. Another case report of acute toxicity linked to noni juice ingestion, this time in a 14-year-old. At least his liver didn't fail more completely like in 2 of the earlier cases. What might you expect from a product also known as vomit fruit? The multi-level marketing company that sells noni products blamed aloe vera juice the boy had also consumed, which is indeed something else I'd encourage folks not to drink. But what about all the scientific studies promoting these types of products bandied about on their respective websites? Recently, a public health researcher took the time to review the science in liquid dietary supplement promotion, evidently a $23 billion market. Central to the marketing of many such products is the citation of scientific studies supporting the product's health claims. While these studies seem deliberately created for marketing purposes, their findings and quality are generally presented in a manner that appears designed to mislead potential consumers. Here they use the case of mangosteen juice, another product I've warned about in the past, as an example of how widely marketed and consumed liquid dietary supplements use exaggeration and pseudoscience to bolster their web promotions of product effectiveness and safety. The multi-level marketing company that sells mangosteen cited a study they paid for to support its assertion that their product is shown to be safe at all dosages tested, and indeed safe for everyone. The study involved exposing just 30 people to their product, though with another 10 given placebo. As the researcher notes here, with that few people exposed, the stuff could kill 1 or 2% of people, and you might never even know. This study of the multi-level marketing product Metabolife had 35 on the stuff, and they seemed to do just fine until it was withdrawn from the market after being linked to 18 heart attacks, 26 strokes, 43 seizures, and 5 deaths. Oops. Hydroxycut was studied on 40 people, no serious side effects, and same story. withdrawn after dozens of cases of organ damage, including massive hepatic necrosis, requiring liver transplants and death. And oftentimes, the multi-level marketing study researchers don't disclose their funding sources, pretending to be objective scientists. But a little detective work exposed a whole web of financial conflicts of interest, at best reducing the face validity of findings, and at worst, they represent deception. On his first day of life, an infant is hospitalized with seizures. The researchers concluded that his mother's daily spirulina use, starting in the 4th month of pregnancy, was likely to blame. I've talked previously about the liver and nerve toxins present in many spirulina supplements, but the supplement companies swear up and down the spirulina doesn't produce these toxins. And they may be right. But if spirulina doesn't produce toxins, how is it that toxins have repeatedly been found in spirulina supplements? It appears to be contamination of spirulina with toxin-producing blue-green algae. So, for example, if you look at the new U.S. Pharmacopoeia safety evaluation of spirulina, they conclude that the available evidence does not indicate a serious risk or other public health concern when spirulina is properly identified, formulated, and used. But that's the catch. You collect spirulina in some open lake, and you have no idea what other algae are going to crop up. The researchers report all sorts of adverse reactions in people taking spirulina products, but they attribute these issues to non-spirulina algae toxin contaminants within spirulina supplements, known to be toxic to the liver and cancer-causing. So unless there's third-party testing of each batch, which no company could presumably afford to do, I continue to encourage people to avoid spirulina products. In 1936, Albert Szent-Györgyi, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering vitamin C, described a vitamin P, which we now know encompasses a class of thousands of phytonutrients called flavonoids. Some, like quercetin, are widespread in plant-based foods. You can tell something is widespread in the plant kingdom when you can even find it in iceberg lettuce. Others, however, are only found in specific plant families. For example, hesperidin is found primarily in citrus fruits. This may be one of the reasons, out of all the different types of fruits that have been looked at, citrus may help cut our risk of stroke the most. The citrus phytonutrient hesperidin increases blood flow. Using a machine called a Doppler fluximeter, you can measure blood flow through the skin using a laser beam. A laser Doppler fluximeter. Sounds like something from Back to the Future. And if you give people the amount of hesperidin found in 2 cups of orange juice, blood flow goes up, though if you instead just give them the orange juice itself, that works even better. So there's other beneficial stuff besides just the hesperidin in citrus. For example, if you measure the changes in genetic expression, orange juice consumption induces changes in the expression in 3,000 of our genes, whereas hesperidin alone only modulated the expression of about 2,000. Still, nearly 2,000 stretches of our DNA expressed differently because we consume just one of the thousands of phytonutrients in plants? Pretty mind-blowing. And these changes in blood flow are not just kind of in theory. Researchers have taken volunteers with cold sensitivity, cold hands, cold feet, put them in an air-conditioned room, and measured the temperature of their fingertips after drinking a placebo drink like orange Kool-Aid, versus drinks with 2 doses of actual citrus phytonutrients. In the Kool-Aid group, their fingers got colder and colder, dropping nearly 9 degrees Fahrenheit. But the fingers of those consuming low or high doses of citrus didn't as much. That's because their blood flow remained steady. Here's that laser test again. Right? When we're exposed to cold temperature, our body starts to clamp off peripheral blood flow to keep our core warm. But if you eat a bunch of oranges before you go skiing, your risk of frostbite may go down since you're keeping up your blood flow to your fingers and toes. They even took these poor women and plunged their hands into some chilly water. And as you can see, their finger temperature rebounded faster towards normal in the citrus group. Of course, having warm hands is nice, but maintaining blood flow to your fingers is not as important as maintaining blood flow to your brain. The same lactic acid that makes yogurt tangy is the same lactic acid that builds up in our muscles when we exercise strenuously. Instead of bacteria fermenting the sugar in milk to make energy for themselves, our muscles ferment sugar in our diet to produce energy to contract. If, like when we're sprinting, lactic acid builds up in our muscles faster than it can be removed, we can end up with a burning sensation in our muscles, forcing us to stop. Now, if we train, we can increase the number of blood vessels in our muscles and clear out the lactate faster. For example, if you take some overweight, sedentary women and start them on an aerobic training program of running and walking, at the end of 3 months, their lactate levels during exercise decrease 17%. But those on the same program who drank 2 cups of orange juice a day decreased their levels 27%. They did the same exercise program, but the citrus group experienced a significant decrease in blood lactate concentration, signifying improvement in physical performance with less muscle fatigue. I don't recommend drinking juice, because you're losing all that wonderful fiber that slows the rate of fruit sugar absorption into our system. Here's the blood sugar spike one might see after drinking Coca-Cola. Compare that to the spike you see with orange juice. No difference. But now what if you ate the same quantity of sugar in the form of orange slices? Significantly lower. So the whole fruit is nearly always better than fruit juice. Now, this is not to say OJ isn't better than Coke. OJ has those citrus phytonutrients like hesperidin, which may be why the women's triglycerides didn't go up, even though they were drinking 2 cups of fruit juice every day. Hesperidin may actually help lower our digestion of fats. But once you get up to 3 cups a day of juice, you can really start bumping up your triglycerides. The burning sensation during strenuous exercise may be related to the buildup of lactic acid in our muscles, but that's different than the delayed onset muscle soreness that occurs in the days following a bout of extreme physical activity, which is thought to be due to inflammation caused by muscle cell damage, little micro tears in the muscle. If it's an inflammatory reaction, then might anti-inflammatory phytonutrients help? The bioflavonoids in citrus may help with the lactic acid buildup, but we may need to ramp it up to the anthocyanin flavonoids in berries to deal with the inflammation. We know, for example, that if you eat about 45 cherries a day, you can significantly reduce the levels of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein in your bloodstream. Such anti-inflammatory effects may be beneficial for the management and prevention of inflammatory diseases, but what about reducing muscle soreness? Well, if you take some guys and make them flex their biceps against way too much weight over and over and over again, the next day the strength in their arms is way down, about a 30% drop, and man, are their arms sore. But if they're drinking some cherry juice, their arms end up hurting less, and they were able to better preserve their strength. Why not just feed them cherries instead of juice? Well, then you can't do a placebo group, since you can't really create a convincing fake cherry, but you can make fake cherry juice in the form of cherry Kool-Aid. This was the first study to examine the effect of the consumption of any cherry product on the symptoms of exercise-induced muscle damage, and cherries indeed seem to work. Follow-up studies show they also work on reducing muscle pain in long-distance runners, speeding recovery after a marathon, and optimizing recovery from exercise is really the holy grail of exercise science. A similar study found anti-inflammatory effects of eating blueberries. They took it a step further, actually, and paid athletes enough to take a muscle biopsy so the researchers could actually see what's happening to their muscles on a microscopic level. It's like this study showing massage can decrease inflammation. At first I was like, ooh, I wouldn't mind being part of that study. Free, relaxing massage, until I read the protocol. You got to rest a few minutes, and then the scalpels come out and slice out some muscle samples. No thanks. Bottom line, all sorts of new high-tech treatments for sore muscles, from needle electrodes, ultrasound, hyperbaric oxygen, even whole body vibration. Don't these ladies look happy? And of course, there's drugs. There's always drugs. But with drugs there are side effects, so this Cherry study, noted in an editorial comment, may provide more of a sensible and realistic treatment option for those suffering from sore and damaged muscles. The scientific question of how to treat the damaged muscle, that's an important one, and these researchers should be applauded for finding a potential treatment that is not only practical, but one that can be enjoyed. If oxidizing glucose to produce energy for our bodies is so messy, creating free radicals, the way cars burning their fuel produce combustion byproducts out the exhaust, even if we're just idling, living our day-to-day lives, what if we rev up our lives and start exercising, really start burning fuel? Then we create more free radicals, more oxidative stress, and so need to eat even more antioxidant-rich foods. Why do we care about oxidative stress? Well, it's implicated in virtually every known human disease, and there's an increasing body of evidence linking free radical production to the process of aging. Why? Because free radicals can damage DNA, our very genetic code. Well, if free radicals damage DNA and exercise produces free radicals, does physical activity induce DNA damage if we don't have enough antioxidants in our system to douse the free radicals? Yes. In fact, ultra-marathoners show evidence of DNA damage in about 10% of their cells tested during a race, which may last for up to 2 weeks after a marathon. But what about just short bouts of exercise? We didn't know until recently. After just 5 minutes of moderate or intense cycling, you can get an uptick in DNA damage. We think it's the oxidative stress, but regardless of the mechanism of exercise-induced DNA damage, the fact that a very short bout of high-intensity exercise can cause an increase in damage to DNA is a cause for concern. But we can block oxidative damage with antioxidant-rich foods. Of course, when drug and supplement companies hear antioxidant-rich foods, they think pills. You can't make billions on broccoli, so pharmacological antioxidant vitamins have been investigated for prophylactic effect against exercise-induced oxidative stress. However, large doses are often required, and in pill form they ironically lead to a state of pro-oxidation and even more oxidative damage. For example, guys doing arm curls taking 500 milligrams of vitamin C appeared to have more muscle damage, inflammation, and oxidative stress. So, instead of vitamin supplementation, how about supplementation with watercress, the badass of the broccoli family? What if 2 hours before exercise you eat a serving of raw watercress and then get thrown on a treadmill whose slope gets cranked up higher and higher until you basically collapse? In the control group, without the watercress preload, which I imagine would describe most athletes, here's the amount of free radicals in their bloodstream at rest and after exhaustive exercise, which is what you'd expect. So if you eat a super healthy antioxidant-packed plant food like watercress before you exercise, can you blunt this effect? Even better. You end up better than you started. At rest after the watercress, you may start out with fewer free radicals, but only when you stress your body to exhaustion can you see the watercress really flex its antioxidant muscle. So what happens to DNA damage? Well, in a test tube, if you take some human blood cells bathed in free radicals, you can reduce the DNA damage it causes by 70% within minutes of dripping some watercress on them. But does that happen within the human body if you just eat it? We didn't know until recently. If you exercise without watercress in your system, DNA damage shoots up. But if you've been eating a single serving a day for 2 months, your body's so juiced up on green leafy goodness, no significant damage after punishing yourself on the treadmill. So, with a healthy diet, can you get all the benefits of strenuous exercise without the potential risks? we know regular physical exercise, key component to a healthy lifestyle, but it can elicit oxidative stress. To reduce that stress, some have suggested pills to improve one's antioxidant defense system, but those eating more plant-based diets may naturally have an enhanced antioxidant defense system without pills to counter exercise-induced oxidative stress due to the increased quantities of plants. Remember, plant foods average 64 times more antioxidants than meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. And on top of that, the animal protein itself can have a pro-oxidant effect. But look, anyone eating sufficient quantities of whole healthy plant foods could plausibly reach an antioxidant status similar to those eating vegetarian. It's not just about what you're eating less of, like saturated fat and cholesterol, but what you're eating more of, the phytonutrients. Whether it's about training longer or living longer, we've got to eat more plants. Unfortunately, as the traditional diets of East Asia westernize, their breast cancer rates have risen, which some have linked to a quadrupling of animal product consumption. This is the breast cancer rate of Japanese women in Japan. If they emigrate to the United States, within 10 years they're up to here, and if they hang around long enough, here's the risk of resident Japanese Americans living in the United States. Note, though, that's still somewhat lower than the U.S. national average. This may be because some of the dietary habits may carry with them, such as soy consumption, green tea, maybe eating more mushrooms, but maybe partly it's the seaweed. We've known for over a decade that in vitro, in a petri dish, seaweed broth is effective at clearing cancer cells. Here's 3 different types of human breast cancer, measuring cancer cell death. Here's what a widely used chemotherapy drug can do, and here's seaweed. Worked even better, and, unlike the chemo, didn't harm normal, non-cancerous breast cells. But what about outside of the test tube in people? Well, a population study comparing women with breast cancer to women without found that consuming a single sheet of nori a day may cut a woman's odds of breast cancer in half. We think it's because seaweed favorably alters estrogen metabolism, likely due to a modulation of the woman's gut bacteria. It appears that the more seaweed you eat, the less estrogen you have in your system, which may lower breast cancer risk. This may be because of all the fiber in sea vegetables, or it may block the enzyme that undermines our body's attempt to flush out excess hormones, or even somehow interfere with estrogen binding to estrogen receptors. Either way, to effectively lower one's estrogen levels, Asian women may be able to get away with maybe 1 sheet of nori a day, but American women are so much bigger that may take closer to 2. There's lots of yummy seaweed snacks out there to make it a tasty experience. Just try to get some low-fat, low-sodium ones. Wakame, the seaweed used fresh in seaweed salads, unfortunately did not appear to reduce breast cancer risk, though it has been found to rather dramatically lower blood pressure in hypertensives. Just 2 teaspoons of seaweed salad a day for a month dropped their blood pressure 14 points, and after 2 months was associated with up to a 2-inch skinnier waistline. As I've mentioned before, though, I recommend avoiding hijiki, which tends to have too much arsenic, and kelp, which tends to have too much iodine. In fact, too much seaweed of any type may actually increase one's risk of thyroid cancer because of the amount of iodine you'd be taking in, but there does not appear to be increased risk at the levels of consumption I'm talking about, like a sheet of nori a day. And a study of seaweed eaters in California actually found decreased risk, but again, we're talking kind of modest levels of intake. I've frequently talked about the benefits of dietary diversity, eating different families of fruits and vegetables, eating different parts of individual plants, like beets and beet greens. If we just stick to land plants, though, we're missing out on all the plants from the other 70% of planet Earth. Sea vegetables have phytonutrients found nowhere else, types of fiber and unique carotenoids and polysaccharides and various polyphenol defense compounds, each of which may have anti-cancer properties. So, I encourage everyone to try experimenting with sea vegetables until you find one you like, even if that just means sprinkling some powdered dulse on your food. Erectile dysfunction is defined as the recurrent or persistent inability to attain and or maintain an erection in order for satisfactory sexual performance. It is present in up to 30 million men in the U.S. and approximately 100 million men worldwide. Wait a second. The U.S. has less than 8% of the world's population, yet up to 30% of the impotents? We're number one. Who cares, though? We've got red, white, and blue pills like Viagra. The problem, though, is the pills just cover up the symptoms of vascular disease and don't do anything for the underlying pathology. Erectile dysfunction and our number one killer, coronary artery disease, are just two manifestations of the same disease: inflamed, clogged, and crippled arteries, regardless of which organ. Atherosclerosis is considered a systemic disorder that uniformly affects all major blood vessels in the body. Hardening of the arteries can lead to softening of the penis because stiffened arteries can't relax normally, open wide, and let the blood flow. So erectile dysfunction may just be the flaccid tip of an iceberg in terms of a systemic disorder. In 2/3 of men showing up to emergency rooms for the first time with crushing chest pain, their penis had been trying to warn them for years that something was wrong with their circulation. Why does it tend to hit the penis first? Because the penile arteries in the penis are half the size of the coronary arteries in our heart. That particular artery is the so-called widowmaker. So the same amount of plaque in the heart that you wouldn't even feel could half clog the penile artery, causing a symptomatic restriction in blood flow. You may not feel chest pain until about here. That's why erectile dysfunction has been called penile angina. In fact, by measuring blood flow in a man's penis, you can predict the results of his cardiac stress test with an accuracy of 80%. Male sexual function is like a penile stress test, a window to the hearts of man. 40% of men over 40 have erectile dysfunction, 40 over 40. Men getting erection difficulties in their 40s have a 50-fold increased risk of having a cardiac event, like sudden death. You've heard me say various things, increase heart disease risk 20%, 30%. That's nearly 5,000%, leading the latest review to ask, is there any risk greater? That's because it's not so much a risk factor for atherosclerosis, it is atherosclerosis. A man with erectile dysfunction, even if he has no cardiac symptoms, should be considered a cardiac patient until proven otherwise. It's considered to be a cardiac equivalent. Right? It's a marker of the coronary artery disease you likely already have. There's therefore more to treating erectile dysfunction than just establishing an erect penis. It offers an opportunity for reducing cardiovascular risk. The reason that even young men should care about their cholesterol is because it predicts erectile dysfunction later in life, and that predicts heart attacks, strokes, and a shortened lifespan. Just gonna keep eating crap because you can pop some pills? All the Viagra in the world may not help your sex life after a stroke. The take-home message is a simple equation. ED stands for early death. Motivating patients to change poor lifestyle habits can be extremely difficult. Preventing cardiovascular events such as heart attacks or strokes are relatively distant benefits, whereas barbecued ribs and cheesecake or sitting on your butt promises almost instant gratification. So public health experts are hoping that prevention or improvement of erectile dysfunction could be a more immediate motivator that physicians can use to improve their patients' lifestyle and, in turn, their overall cardiovascular health. That's how doctors can save a life during a clinic visit for erectile dysfunction. We used to think of erectile dysfunction in young men in their 20s and 30s as psychogenic in origin, meaning it's all in their heads. But now we're realizing it's more likely the early signs of vascular disease. But even when the penis heads in the wrong direction, the heart need not follow. Atherosclerosis in both organs can be reversed with lifestyle changes. We know that a substantial body of knowledge demonstrates that the abundant consumption of food of plant origin, including vegetables, fruit, and whole grain, and the dietary patterns rich in these foods convey a markedly lower risk of coronary disease. So they tried putting impotent men on a Mediterranean diet, the main characteristics of which include an abundance of plant food. 37% of the men on the Mediterranean diet for 2 years regained normal sexual function. What about the diet appeared to do it? Improvements in erectile function was tied to 5 things: increased intake of fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, and essentially the ratio of plant to animal fats. Similar benefits were found for women. Same kind of diet significantly improved sexual function, together with a significant reduction of systemic inflammation. As a whole, these findings suggest that a Mediterranean-style diet may be a safe strategy for amelioration of sexual function in women with prediabetes or diabetes, a significant improvement in sexual satisfaction on the healthier diet. Why, though? Well, as dietary fiber may have anti-inflammatory roles, it may be the fiber content of all those plants in the Mediterranean diet magnified by all the antioxidants. This is the current thinking, given the anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects of a plant-based diet. But does it really matter why? From a public health perspective, it may be unnecessary to elucidate every mechanism of single components. Let's just recommend people to eat healthy, such as decreasing fat and increasing whole grains and greens. Erectile dysfunction is considered an important cause of decreased quality of life in men. In fact, so much so that one early theory suggested that this may explain the link between impotence and heart attacks. Depression is a risk factor for coronary heart disease, and the thought was that men who couldn't get it up became so depressed that they die of a broken heart. But now we know that erectile dysfunction and heart disease can be 2 different manifestations of the exact same root problem: diseased arteries. Inflamed, oxidized, cholesterol-clogged blood vessels. So no wonder a diet chock full of anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, cholesterol-lowering plant foods would improve sexual functioning in both men and women, as well as reduce risk of heart disease. But why go low risk when you can shoot for no risk? A totally plant-based diet can even stop and reverse our number 1 killer. Of all the plant foods individually examined so far, nuts are among those most tied to longevity. Just 2 handfuls of nuts a week may extend a woman's life as much as jogging 4 hours a week. So if nuts reduce the risk of heart disease, might they also help with sexual function? Well, men eating 3 to 4 handfuls of pistachios a day for just 3 weeks experienced a significant improvement in blood flow through the penis, accompanied by significantly firmer erections. May not be surprising. Remember how antioxidant-rich foods have a Viagra-like effect of boosting nitric oxide production? Well, pistachios are certainly rich sources of antioxidants. And remember how the citrulline in watermelons helped with erection firmness by boosting arginine, which is what our body makes nitric oxide out of? Well, pistachios have a bunch of arginine, which may help explain the improvement in blood flow. And we know that cholesterol is an important predictor of sexual dysfunction in both men and women, and after just 3 weeks on all those pistachios, there were significant improvements in cholesterol. And like other studies that piled on hundreds of calories of nuts a day, there was no weight gain. Conclusion: just 3 weeks of pistachios resulted in a significant improvement in erectile function, with additional improvement in cholesterol without any side effects. Note the 2 important differences between diet and drugs. Just taking drugs like Viagra to poison this enzyme and artificially boost nitric oxide signaling is just covering up the symptoms of the underlying problem, unhealthy arteries, whereas eating whole healthy plant foods like nuts actually helps attack the root cause, cholesterol oxidation and inflammation, and only has good side effects. This enzyme that Viagra-like drugs muck with is primarily found in two places in the body: the erectile tissue of the penis and the retina of the eye. That's why the FDA encourages people to stop taking drugs like Viagra and call a doctor right away if you experience sudden loss of vision. Of course, you can still find your phone, though the harms tend to be self-limited and reversible, such as cyanopsia, in which your vision suddenly becomes tinted blue. Why risk side effects at all when the problem can be reversed, cured in the first place, improving the quality and quantity of our lives? Improvement of sexual function in men and women should be added to the growing list of clinical benefits brought about by healthy lifestyles in human beings. The poison gas phosgene, first used extensively as a chemical warfare agent during World War I, can cause a horrific lung disease called bronchiolitis obliterans, in which your small airways are essentially obliterated, a generally irreversible, fatal condition that may also be caused by butter-flavored microwave popcorn. I've warned previously about diacetyl, the artificial butter flavor linked to a condition known as popcorn lung in workers who had been exposed to it and started dying from it. Turns out the industry knew about the dangers for decades, but covered it up. Even when workers started dying, the company swore the chemical was safe for consumers, though, that it was only an occupational health hazard. In fact, they even had ads with Orville Redenbacher telling consumers to breathe deep. But I quipped in my last video that any ingredient requiring the use of a gas mask is probably not something you want to feed your family. I wanted to err on the side of caution, and I'm glad I did. A series of cases of consumers of butter-flavored microwave popcorn developing bronchiolitis obliterans. 47-year-old woman who consumed 3 to 5 bags a day and now can't even walk without getting out of breath. She's currently awaiting a lung transplant. 56-year-old man, another lifelong non-smoker, but ate 2 to 3 bags a day before he started coughing up blood. His doctor alerted the FDA, but it remains on the market to this day. A third, just 1 to 2 bags a day, and her Jolly Time Pop secret was ending up with lungs so scarred they had what's called honeycombing and patches with the appearance of ground glass. Now, the chemical is found in real butter too, but is heavily concentrated when added as an additional flavoring and remains legal on store shelves to this day. The regulation of health hazards from food additives has simply fallen between the regulatory and health surveillance cracks. They recommend a series of steps to protect consumers, such as allowing the bag to cool completely before opening, but who wants cold popcorn, and then opening in a well-ventilated area away from the face. One solution they didn't mention that would also eliminate the risk of lung disease: don't buy it. Every year in the United States, doctors write 20 million prescriptions for stimulants like Ritalin to give to kids for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it goes up every year. In fact, more than any other drug class, another 0.8 million added every year to that 20 million. That's a lot of amphetamines for a lot of kids. These drugs are thought to act by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine levels in the brain. Well, guess what else can increase dopamine and norepinephrine levels? Exercise, and it happens within minutes of getting on a bike. Levels shoot up. Medications can take an hour to work. Physical activity works almost immediately. But does it work for ADHD? According to the latest review, there isn't a lot of research out there, but the current evidence suggests that both acute and chronic physical activity can mitigate ADHD symptoms. So, while medications and exercise with regard to ADHD shows that they both work to more adequately regulate dopamine and norepinephrine levels in the brain. Some of the new long-acting formulations of drugs can work for up to 12 hours, whereas the therapeutic effect of exercise may only last an hour or so. But the drugs produce unwanted side effects and have the potential for abuse. Exercise has been shown to be effective in controlling ADHD symptoms and has essentially no side effects. Well, it's not really true. It should be noted that a major difference in the two treatment modalities is that medications have a defined effect on ADHD symptoms alone, whereas exercise produces physical, mental, and emotional advantages that are far-reaching. So exercise does have side effects, but they're all good. It is estimated that there are currently thousands of additives in our food supply. Some are good, like supplementing foods with vitamin B12, for example. Others you have to weigh the risks and benefits, like the nitrites in processed meats. Yes, they may increase your risk of cancer, but as preservatives, they decrease your risk of dying from botulism. Then there are additives used for purely cosmetic purposes, like food dyes, used to provide color to colorless and fun foods. According to the FDA, without color additives, colas wouldn't be brown, margarine wouldn't be yellow, and mint ice cream wouldn't be green. Heaven forbid! According to the FDA, color additives are now recognized as an important part of practically all processed foods we eat. Because we are eating a lot more processed foods, we're now getting 5 times more food dyes in our daily diet than we were 50 years ago. 15 million pounds of food dyes are used every year in foods, drugs, and cosmetics in the United States. I always wondered why they called them like blue number 1 instead of their actual chemical names in the list of ingredients. Then, after reading this report from the Center for Science and the Public Interest, I realized why. Here's a box of Kraft mac and cheese. It has yellow number 5. Do you think people would be as likely to buy this product if instead of quote-unquote yellow number 5, it said this instead on the label? This list of approved colors used to be longer, but different dyes keep getting banned, including violet number 1, which ironically was the color used in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's meat inspection stamp, so they may have been actually further cancering up the meat. Years ago, I featured this landmark study, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled food challenge, published in perhaps the most prestigious medical journal in the world, showing artificial colors increased inattentiveness, impulsivity, and hyperactivity among young children. So what happened? Well, the British government said, OK, there's no health benefits to these dyes, only health risks, so it's a no-brainer. The British government mandated that food manufacturers remove most of the artificial food colors from their products. In fact, the whole European Union said, fine, you want to continue to use these dyes? Then you have to put a warning label stating, look, may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children. So many international food companies have taken them out of their products in Europe, but they continue to use them in the same products here in the US, where similar regulations are not currently in place. Why not? The FDA put together a committee that looked at that same landmark study and conceded that the food additives may have resulted in changes in behavior, but the type of treatment effects reported in the study, even though the investigators referred to increases in levels of hyperactivity, were not the disruptive excessive hyperactivity behaviors of ADHD, but more likely the type of overactivity exhibited occasionally by the general population of preschool and school-aged children. To which a distinguished toxicologist responded, look, low-level lead exposure may only shave off a few IQ points off of kids, but just because they'd still fall within the normal range doesn't mean it's OK to expose kids to it. In fact, now looking back, the lead and leaded gas may have been causing brain cancer and even urban violence. The aggravated assault rate in cities around the U.S. seemed to follow the lead levels in the air pretty closely. Anyways, CSPI continues to call on the FDA to ban food dyes and for food companies to voluntarily stop using them. Good luck with that. In the meanwhile, some researchers recently suggested a way to see which food colors may be damaging your children's brain. advising parents to test artificial colors by purchasing little bottles of food dye at the grocery store. Then have your child do some homework or something, and then have them chug down an artificial color and see if it affects their handwriting, reading, math at 30 minutes, then at 90 minutes, then at 3 hours. Also, see if they get irritable later, have problems sleeping. Then, if that's OK, you try even more to see if that will mess up their mind. If I may offer an alternate suggestion, maybe we shouldn't be buying our kids processed crap in the first place. What happens if you give one group of kids a plate of cookies and the other group the same number of cookies, but cut in half, and tell them all they can eat as many as they want? Decreasing the cookie size led to 25% fewer cookie calories eaten. The goal of this study was to help counter obesity-promoting eating behaviors facilitated by the availability of large portions of junk food. And the findings suggest that reducing the size of cookies without altering the total amount of food decreases children's short-term energy intake, a dietary strategy for guardians to discreetly decrease cookie intake. But do you know what's in those things? Partially hydrogenated oil, trans fats. No one should be eating those. In fact, I can think of another dietary strategy to decrease kids' intake. Don't give them any. Admittedly, easier said than done. Even in the granola crunchy Bay Area, when parents and school administrators proposed to ban junk food, it sent a faction of parents and teachers into an apoplectic fit. In Texas, there was such parental outrage they got lawmakers to pass a Safe Cupcake Amendment. The amendment, known as Lauren's Law, ensures that parents and grandparents of school children celebrating a birthday can bring whatever the heck they want to school. Fine. What if you just offered fruit in addition to the cupcakes at classroom celebrations? To observe student responses to the addition of fresh fruit, bowls of fresh cut-up fruit provided by the researchers were added to the party food contributed by the parents at half the 4 kindergarten or preschool celebrations studied. No special effort was made to encourage students to choose the fruit, they just put it out there. Would kids actually eat fruit when there was a birthday cake, ice cream, and cheese puffs taking up nearly a whopping third of their daily caloric intake? Yes, on average, each kid ate a full fruit serving. Take that, cheesy puffs! There are entire curricula available now for schools like Vegucation, where for a whole year classrooms feature a new Veggie of the Month, sprinkled with nutrition mantras like fiber equals a happy tummy. And it works. The active engagement in students in tasting and rating of vegetable dishes seemed to have contributed to higher consumption of featured vegetables. One school was able, in some cases, to double vegetable consumption just by giving them attractive names. Elementary students ate twice the number of carrots if they were called X-ray vision carrots than if they were just carrots or generically named as the food of the day. How about Power Punch broccoli, silly dilly green beans, or calling broccoli tiny tasty treetops? Selection of broccoli increased 100%. Green beans up 177%. Conclusion: these studies demonstrate that using an attractive name to describe a healthy food in a cafeteria is robustly effective, persistent, and scalable with little or no money or experience. These names were not carefully crafted, discussed in focus groups, and then pre-tested. They just thought them up. What a concept. Right? And kids were suckered into eating healthier for months by putting out silly little signs. Vegetable intake up nearly 100% across the board, and in the control school without signs, vegetable consumption started low and actually got worse. So why isn't every single school in the country doing this right now? Bring it up at your next PTA meeting. And if you want to get really bold, you can join the nutritious school lunch revolution led by pioneering organizations like the New York Coalition for Healthy School Food. If you offer kids broccoli or a chocolate bar, which do you think they'd pick? A study showed 4 out of 5 picked the chocolate. OK, but how proud are the parents of the kids that chose the broccoli right now? But what if you put an Elmo sticker on the broccoli? When an Elmo sticker was placed on the broccoli, it was half and half. 50% chose the broccoli. It works in schools, too. A picture of SpongeBob saying, "Got beans," and 37% more boys, 70% more girls chose green beans. One little sign, and kids were eating significantly more vegetables. We saw how we should cut up, or ideally cut out, cookies to minimize consumption. How should we cut up vegetables to maximize consumption? Which do you think 9 to 12-year-olds ate more of, whole slices, sticks, or stars? And do they like them bigger or smaller? The results were strikingly clear. Turns out shape was very influential. Children clearly preferred having their vegetables cut. Stars were liked the most. What about slices versus sticks? No difference. And size only mattered for the whole chunk, where the ordinary size was preferred to the miniature versions. If they're still not biting, you can apply the same trick I used to get our dog to eat stuff she doesn't like. Dip it in peanut butter. Pairing vegetables with peanut butter may successfully increase intake even in vegetable-resistant children. Offering a salad dressing dip may help as well. Then there's always the hidden vegetable strategy. In the present study, broccoli, cauliflower, tomato, squash, and zucchini were covertly added to familiar entrees, so the appearance, flavor, and texture of the original recipes were maintained, like pureeing vegetables into a pasta sauce, and families weren't the wiser. This shouldn't be the only way, though. Covertly incorporating vegetables into foods can have a beneficial effect on children's vegetable intake, but it should not be the only way the vegetables are served to children. Because the liking of an originally disliked vegetable can be increased through repeated exposure, it's important to use several strategies to ensure that children experience different forms of vegetables, especially whole vegetables, because they're not going to live at home forever. Worst comes to worst, you can make a video game. A public-private partnership, the quest to Lava Mountain, where you can apparently harvest kale and gain knowledge about the health benefits of eating healthy foods, such as fruits, vegetables, and whole grain foods, and the detrimental effects of eating junk. What may be the best way, though, to get kids to eat more fruits and vegetables? This study looked at all sorts of parenting styles. Should you pressure them? Should you lay off? And what was the most important factor? The results indicated that the most important predictor of children's fruit consumption was, wait for it, the parents' consumption, and pretty much the same with vegetables. If we want our kids to eat healthy, we have to model healthy behavior. The researchers conclude that in order to try to increase children's fruit and vegetable consumption, parents should be guided to improve their own darn diet first. We saw that just changing the name of healthy foods can have a significant impact on children's eating habits. Are adults as gullible? Yes. For example, people actually report traditional Cajun red beans and rice tastes better than just red beans and rice, even though they were both the exact same dish. It's funny, back in World War II, much of domestic meat was shipped overseas, just leaving lots of organs behind, the hearts, kidneys, brains, stomachs, intestines, even the feet, ears, and heads of cows, hogs, sheep, and chickens. The challenge was, how are they going to convince people, encourage people to eat chicken heads? Well, to accomplish this, the Department of Defense enlisted dozens of the brightest, most famous psychologists to determine how dietary change could be accomplished. Apparently, taste wasn't the problem. People would eat brains as long as you didn't tell them they were eating brains. So the solution was to invent mystery meat. Just don't tell consumers what they're eating. And the same can apply with healthier foods. As with organ meats in the 1940s, the suggestion that a food contains soy may be so powerful that some people convince themselves that they do not like the taste. For example, if you give someone an energy bar that says it has soy protein in it, people rate it as grainy and tasteless compared to identical bars with no mention of the word soy. In reality, there is no soy in either of the bars. It's what you call a phantom ingredient taste test. Simply the suggested presence of soy made people believe they tasted it, and they evaluated it accordingly. In general, a large percentage of consumers taste what they want to taste. So can you use the same vegetable sneak attack tactic so successful in children? Covertly adding hidden pureed vegetables to meals works for adults too, and even for vegetables they didn't like. It was shown that the adults' dislike of the vegetables that were incorporated into the entrees did not affect the consumption of the vegetable-enhanced entrees. Who couldn't use a little vegetable enhancement? This indicates that the incorporation of pureed vegetables into entrees increased the intake of vegetables even when the added vegetable was disliked, the big babies. And of course, the more vegetables you eat, the less calories you get, so you get a twin benefit. Right? They were eating up to a pound of vegetables a day and 350 fewer calories. Right? More food, less calories. Keep that up, you could lose 30 pounds a year without even trying. How can we overcome our built-in hunger drives for salt, sugar, and fat? We now have scientific evidence to back up the claim that if you go a few weeks cutting down on junk food and animal products, your tastes start to change. We now think humans may actually taste fat, just like we taste sweet, sour, salty, and people on low-fat diets start liking low-fat foods more and high-fat foods less. Our tongues may actually become more sensitive to fat. And the more sensitive our tongue becomes, the less butter, meat, dairy, and eggs we eat. Whereas a blunted taste for fat, if we pile too much of it into our face, is associated with eating more calories, more fat, more dairy, meat, and eggs, and being fatter ourselves. And this change in sensation, this numbing of our fat sensation, can happen after just a few weeks. Put people on a low-salt diet, and over the weeks they like the taste of salt-free soup more and more, and the taste of salty soup less and less. Your tastes physically change. If you let them salt their own soup to taste, they add less and less the longer on the low-sodium diet. Tastes just as salty with half the salt. A control group liked lots of salt in their soup, but for those who had been on salt-restricted diets, regularly salted foods tasted way too salty and actually preferred soup with less. People should be assured that their diet may gradually become more acceptable as their taste for salt diminishes. The longer we eat healthier foods, the better they taste. Inadequate fruit and vegetable consumption may kill millions around the globe every year. So the public health community is not beyond appealing to vanity. Health is intimately linked with attractiveness. How do you tell if someone's healthy? You look for that golden glow that comes from the carotenoids in fruits and vegetables, found to increase the attractiveness of African, Asian, and Caucasian faces. These are kind of before and after shots with more and more fruits and vegetables as you go left to right. Most think the greater fruit and veggie group on the right appears healthier and more attractive. College students going from 3 servings a day to the recommended minimum of 9 servings a day for just 6 weeks significantly improved skin color, and it's possible that even smaller dietary changes could have helped as well. And the worse we now eat, the more attractive we may become. Public health advocates hope this research, suggesting healthy eating may affect mate choice and sexual selection, provides a powerful message for promoting healthy eating towards boosting fruit and veggie intake up to 13 servings a day. And while a rosy glow associated with cardiovascular health in the face and lips can also increase one's appearance of healthfulness and attractiveness, the color red can also reduce junk food intake. People drink less soda from cups with red stickers than from cups with blue stickers, and eat less from red plates than from blue or white plates. How crazy is that? Check it out. They speculate it's because our brains subconsciously are thinking, red traffic lights, stop signs, red alert. What are you putting in your poor body? Thousands of Americans continue to die from asbestos exposure decades after many uses were banned, because the cancers can take years to show up. We're now in the so-called third wave of asbestos-related disease. The first wave was in the asbestos miners, which started in the 1920s. The second phase was in the workers, the shipbuilders and construction workers that used the stuff in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Now, as buildings constructed with asbestos over the past 6 decades begin to age and deteriorate, not only are workers at risk, but potential also exists for serious environmental exposure to asbestos among residents, tenants, and users of these buildings, such as school children, office workers, maintenance workers, and the general public. The CDC, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the EPA have projected over the next 30 years approximately 1,000 cases of mesothelioma and lung cancer will occur among persons in the United States exposed to asbestos in school buildings as school children. But it all started with the workers. As one internal industry memo callously put it, if you've enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it? To see if something is carcinogenic, you study those who have the most exposure. That's how we learned about the potential cancer-causing dangers of asbestos, and that's how we're learning about the potential cancer-causing dangers of poultry viruses. For years, I've talked about the excess mortality in poultry workers associated with these wart-causing chicken cancer viruses that may be transmitted to those in the general population handling fresh or frozen chicken. Last year, I talked about the largest study to date at the time, confirming the findings of 3 other studies that workers in poultry slaughtering and processing plants have increased risk of dying from certain cancers, and adding death from penis cancer to the risks linked to poultry exposure. That was looking at 20,000 poultry workers. Well, we have yet another study looking at 30,000. The purpose of the study was to test the hypothesis that exposure to poultry cancer viruses that widely occurs occupationally in poultry workers, not to mention the general population, may be associated with increased risk of deaths from liver and pancreatic cancers. They found that those who slaughter chickens have about 9 times the odds of both pancreatic cancer and liver cancer. Just to put that in context, the most carefully studied risk factor for pancreatic cancer, one of our deadliest cancers, is cigarette smoking. Even if you smoke for more than 50 years, though, you only about double your odds of pancreatic cancer. Those that slaughter poultry appear to have nearly 9 times the odds. For liver cancer, it's more alcohol. Those that consume more than 4 drinks a day have triple the odds of lung cancer, whereas poultry slaughtering appears to increase one's odds 9-fold. There are diseases unique to the meat industry, like the newly described salami brusher's disease that affects those whose job it is to wire brush off the white mold that naturally grows on salami for 8 hours a day. But most diseases suffered by meat workers are more universal. The reason the connection between asbestos and cancer was so easy to nail down is that asbestos caused a particularly unusual cancer, which was virtually unknown until there was widespread asbestos mining and industrial use. But the pancreatic cancer one might get from handling chicken is the same pancreatic cancer one might get from smoking cigarettes, so it's more difficult to tease out a cause-and-effect relationship. So don't expect to see an asbestos-type ban on Kentucky Fried Chicken anytime soon. Although those with the most poultry exposure appear to suffer the greatest excess mortality, surplus cancer deaths are also found in other slaughterhouse workers, and this research goes back decades. Higher cancer rates in butchers, and slaughterhouse workers, meat cutters, and those working in processing plants. The bottom line is that it's clear from this large study and others reported in the literature that workers in the meat industry are at increased risk of developing and dying from cancer. The increased risk may be due to these animal-to-human viruses, or antigenic stimulation through chronic exposure to animal protein. And in fact, cancer-causing virus exposure could help explain why those who eat meat have higher cancer rates. There's even a retrovirus associated with cancerous fish tumors, which is speculated as a cause for increased cancer rates in American seafood workers. Growing up on a livestock farm is associated with higher rates of blood-borne cancers, lymphomas, leukemias, but growing up on a farm raising only crops was not. Worst was growing up on a poultry farm, consistent with chicken consumption being most tied closely to these same cancers. A quarter of daily chicken breast associated with a doubling or tripling of lymphoma risk. Researchers are finally able to start connecting the dots. High levels of antibodies to avian leukosis, sarcoma viruses, and reticuloendotheliosis viruses recently found in poultry workers provides evidence of infectious exposure to these cancer-causing poultry viruses. And some of the highest levels were found not in like the eviscerators, the gut pullers, or those that hang the live birds, but just among the line workers that just cut up the final product. In an attempt to narrow down which diseases were associated with which meat, researchers tried separating out those in the pig slaughtering and pork processing. One of the primary sources of concern is in the use of pig organs and tissues as transplants in humans, which is widely practiced, is the fear of introducing zoonotic infections. What they're concerned about is what's called PERV transmission, the pig-to-human transmission of porcine endogenous retroviruses, raising theoretical concerns about cancer, immunological, and neurological disorders. But you don't need to get a pig valve to be exposed. It's found in the blood of pigs, and so people exposed to pig blood may be exposed to the virus. The main findings unique to the pork study, not found in beef or sheep processing, was the significant excesses of deaths from senile conditions such as Alzheimer's disease. Reminds me of those poor pork brain extraction workers. You think your job is bad? How would you like to work at the head table? Well, that doesn't sound so bad, until you learn it's where, in the unbridled use of compressed air in the pursuit of the maximum yield of soft tissues, they blow the brains out of severed swine heads. As the line speeds increased, the workers reported being unable to place the skulls completely on the brain removal device before triggering the compressed air, causing greater splatter of brain material. The aerosolized mist of brain is blamed for dozens of cases of inflammatory neurological disease in workers who started with symptoms as mild as pain, tingling, and difficulty walking, and ended up as bad as having to be put in a coma for 6 weeks because of unrelenting seizures. At first I thought it was some brain parasite, but now it's known to be an autoimmune attack triggered by the exposure to aerosolized brain. A similar mechanism has been blamed for meat proteins triggering inflammatory arthritis in people eating meat. See, by eating fellow animals, we are exposed not only to fellow animal diseases, but to animal tissues that our body may mistake as our own. This may be an advantage to eating a more plant-based diet. By eating outside of the animal kingdom, dipping into the plant kingdom or fungi, not only do we not have to worry about getting something like Dutch elm disease, right? Never has an autoimmune polyradiculoneuropathy been blamed on a head of lettuce. In designing an antibiotic, you wouldn't create a drug that destroyed DNA, for example, because that's something that both humans and bacteria share in common. It would kill the bacteria, all right, but it might kill us too. So, many antibiotics work by attacking the bacterial cell wall, something bacteria have that we don't. Antifungals can attack the unique cell walls of fungus. Pesticides can work by attacking the special exoskeleton of insects, but fighting cancer is harder, because cancer cells are our own cells. So fighting cancer comes down to trying to find and exploit differences between cancer cells and normal cells. 40 years ago, a landmark paper was published showing for the first time that many human cancers have what's called absolute methionine dependency, meaning you can grow normal cells in a petri dish without giving them the amino acid methionine. Normal cells thrive, but without methionine, cancer cells die. Normal breast cells, for example, grow no matter what, with or without. But here's leukemia cells. They need that extra added methionine to grow, or they just flatline. What does cancer do with the methionine? Tumors generate gaseous sulfur-containing compounds with it that specially trained diagnostic dogs can actually pick up. There are mole-sniffing dogs that can pick out skin cancer. There are breath-sniffing dogs that can pick out people with lung cancer. Pee-sniffing dogs that can diagnose bladder cancer, and yes, you guessed it, fart-sniffing dogs for colorectal cancer. Doctors can now bring their lab to the lab. Gives a whole new meaning to the term PET scan. Anyway, methionine dependency is not just present in cancer cell lines in a petri dish. Fresh tumors taken from patients show that many cancers appear to have biochemical defects that makes them methionine dependent, including some tumors of the colon, breast, ovary, prostate, and skin. Chemo companies are fighting to be the first to come out with methionine-depleting drugs, but since methionine is sourced mainly from food, a better strategy may be to lower methionine levels by lowering methionine intake, eliminating high methionine foods for cancer growth control. Here's the thinking. Look, smoking cessation, consumption of diets rich in plants, and other lifestyle measures can prevent the majority of cancers. Unfortunately, people don't do them, and as a result, each year hundreds of thousands of Americans develop metastatic cancer. Chemotherapy cures only a few types of metastatic cancer. Unfortunately, the vast majority of common metastatic cancers, like breast, prostate, colon, and lung, are lethal. We therefore desperately need novel treatment strategies for metastatic cancer, and dietary methionine restriction may be one such strategy. So, where is methionine found? Particularly chicken and fish. Milk, red meat, and eggs has less, but if you really want to stick with lower methionine foods, fruits, nuts, veggies, grains, and beans. In other words, methionine restriction may be achieved using a predominantly vegan diet. So why isn't every oncologist doing this? Despite many promising preclinical and clinical studies in recent years, dietary methionine restriction and other dietary approaches to cancer treatment have not yet gained widespread clinical application. Most clinicians and investigators are probably unfamiliar with nutritional approaches to cancer. That's an understatement. Many others may consider amino acid restriction as an old idea, since it's been examined for several decades. However, many good ideas remain latent for decades, if not centuries, before they prove valuable in the clinic. With the proper development, dietary methionine restriction, either alone or in combination with other treatments, may prove to have a major impact on patients with cancer. This recent review, noting that vegan diets, in part because they tend to be naturally low in methionine, may prove to be a useful nutritional strategy in cancer growth control, also looked at methionine restriction and lifespan extension. It seems that the less methionine there is in body tissues, the longer different animals tend to live. But what are the possible implications for humans? I've talked before about the free radical theory of aging, this concept that aging can be thought of as the oxidation of our bodies, just like rust is the oxidation of metal. And methionine is thought to have a pro-oxidant effect. So the thinking is that lower methionine intake leads to less free radical production, the so-called reactive oxygen species, which slows the rate of DNA damage, which then would slow the rate of DNA mutation, slowing the rate of aging and disease, thereby potentially increasing our lifespan. There are three ways to lower methionine intake. Caloric restriction, they call it dietary restriction here, meaning like you cut your intake of food in half, for example, only eating every other day. That would lower your methionine intake. Or because methionine is found concentrated in certain proteins, you could practice protein restriction across the board, eating a relatively protein-deficient diet. Or the third option is to eat enough food, eat enough protein, but just eat plant proteins because they are relatively low in methionine. Caloric restriction is hard because we walk around starving all the time. Something like every other day eating is never likely to gain much popularity as a pro-longevity strategy for humans, so it may be more feasible to achieve moderate methionine restriction in light of the fact that plant-based diets tend to be relatively low in this amino acid. As we've seen, plant products tend to be lower in methionine than animal products. Yes, protein restriction across the board can be performed to avoid the hunger of caloric restriction, but again, methionine restriction could also be performed emphasizing low methionine, high-quality vegetable sources of protein. Among foods containing plant proteins, legumes are especially rich in essential amino acids, offering excellent substitutes for proteins of animal origin. The fact that beans have comparatively low methionine has been classically considered a disadvantage. But given the capacity of methionine restriction to decrease the rate of free radical generation in internal organs, to lower markers of chronic disease, and to increase maximum longevity, ironically converts such a quote-unquote disadvantage into a strong advantage, and fits well within the important role of beans in healthy diets like the traditional Mediterranean diet. Interestingly, soy protein is also especially poor in methionine, and it's widely considered that soy-containing foods have healthy effects in human beings. Now, on a population level, folks could benefit from just lowering their protein intake, period. The mean intake of proteins, and thus methionine, of Western human populations is much higher than needed. Therefore, decreasing such levels has a great potential to lower tissue oxidative stress and to increase healthy lifespan in humans, while avoiding the possible undesirable effects of caloric restriction. We're eating twice as much protein as we need, so first thing we can recommend is just decreasing the intake of protein. Has a large potential to bring about health benefits. But then we can lower methionine even further eating a plant-based diet. The reason plant-based diets are so protective is not known. Yes, vegetables contain thousands of phytochemicals, but separately investigating their possible protective roles would be an impossible task. The idea that the protective effect is not due to any of the individual plant food components, but to a synergistic combined effect, is gaining acceptance. However, based on the relationship of excess dietary methionine with toxicity to major vital organs, and its likely mechanism of action through increase in free radical generation, the possibility exists that the protective effects of plant-based diets can be due, at least in part, to their lower methionine content. This is not a new idea. It was proposed back in 2009, but is only now gaining increasing acceptance in more mainstream scientific circles. The idea that low methionine content of vegan diets may make methionine restriction feasible as a life extension strategy. It was this landmark study, published in 1953, that radically changed our view about the development of heart disease forever. A series of 300 autopsies performed on U.S. battle casualties of the Korean War. Average age, 22. 22 years old, but 77% of their hearts had gross evidence, meaning visible to the eye evidence, of coronary atherosclerosis, hardening of their arteries. Some of them had vessels that were clogged off 90% or more. As an editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association concluded, this widely cited publication dramatically showed that atherosclerotic changes appear in the coronary arteries years and decades before the age at which coronary heart disease becomes a clinically recognized problem, before symptoms arise. Follow-up studies on the hearts of thousands more soldiers over the subsequent years confirmed their results. How young does it go? Fatty streaks, the first stage of atherosclerosis, was found in the arteries of 100% of kids by age 10. What's accounting for this buildup of plaque even in childhood? In the 80s, we got our first clue, the now famous Bogalusa Heart Study, looking at autopsies of those dying between the ages of 3 years old to age 26, and the number one risk factor was cholesterol. You could see the stepwise increase in the amount of their arteries covered in fatty streaks as the level of bad cholesterol in the blood increased. As powerful as this was only looking at 30 kids. So they decided to study 3,000. 3,000 accidental death victims, ages 15 through 34. After thousands of autopsies, they were able to produce a scoring system, able to predict advanced atherosclerotic lesions, the coronary arteries of young people. The higher your score, the higher the likelihood you have these lesions growing in your heart. So if you're in your teens, 20s, early 30s, and you smoke, your risk goes up a point. If you have high blood pressure at such a young age, that's 4 points. If you're an obese male, 6 points. But high cholesterol was the worst. If your non-HDL cholesterol, meaning your total cholesterol minus your good cholesterol, is above like 220, that's like 8 times worse than smoking. So let's say you're a young woman with relatively high cholesterol, but you don't smoke, you're not overweight, your blood pressure and blood sugars are fine. At your sweet 16, there's just a few % chance you already have an advanced atherosclerotic lesion in your heart. But if you don't improve your diet, by your 30th birthday, there may be like a 1 in 5 chance you have some serious heart disease. And if you have really high cholesterol, it could be closer to 1 in 3. Bringing your cholesterol down to even just that of a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and you're down to here. And if you exercise to boost your HDL, you can extrapolate down a little further. So what this shows us is that even in 15 to 19-year-olds, atherosclerosis has begun in a substantial number of individuals, and this observation suggests beginning primary prevention, at least by the late teenage years, to ameliorate every stage of atherosclerosis and to prevent a retard progression to more advanced lesions. You start kids out on a low saturated fat diet, and you may see a significant improvement in their arterial function by 11 years old. Exposure to high serum cholesterol, even in childhood, may accelerate the development of atherosclerosis. Consequently, the long-term prevention of atherosclerosis might be most effective when initiated early in life, as in 7 months of age. Atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, begins in childhood. Remember, by age 10, nearly all kids have fatty streaks, the first stage of the disease. Then, the plaques start forming in our 20s, and get worse in our 30s, and then can start killing us off. In our hearts, it's a heart attack. In our brains, it's a stroke. In our extremities, it can mean gangrene. In our aorta, an aneurysm. If there is anyone watching this video that is older than 10 years of age, the choice likely isn't whether or not to eat healthy to prevent heart disease. It's whether or not you want to reverse the heart disease you already have. Ornish and Esselstyn proved you can reverse heart disease with a plant-based diet. But we don't have to wait until our first heart attack to reverse the clogging of our arteries. We can start reversing our heart disease right now. We can start reversing heart disease in our kids tonight.